There was a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi who lived in Israel during the time when the judges were in charge. There was a great shortage of food in Israel that caused them to move to a foreign country called Moab. Elimelech and Naomi raised 2 sons, and when their sons grew up, they each married women from Moab. Sadly, Naomi's husband and 2 sons died, and Naomi was left alone with her 2 daughter-in-laws. She told them that she was going to move back to Israel and that they should return to their own families. But one of the women, Ruth, refused to leave Naomi. She said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So Naomi and Ruth moved back to Israel to begin a new life. One day, Ruth went to a field to pick up the grain that the farmers had left behind. Little did she know that the owner of the field was Boaz, a relative of Naomi. Boaz was kind to her and offered her to come find food whenever she wanted. Naomi was getting older, so she came up with a plan to provide for Ruth once she was gone. She suggested that Ruth sneak into Boaz's bedroom while he was sleeping, uncover his feet, and ask him to take care of her. Ruth took Naomi's advice. She uncovered Boaz's feet and laid down next to him. In the middle of the night, Boaz woke up startled. Ruth asked him to care for and protect her. Boaz agreed, but said he needed to first buy the land she lived on so that he would have the right to marry her. So Boaz brought together the decision makers of his town and asked for permission to buy the land. The leaders gave Boaz permission and prayed that God would help Ruth be a great wife. They were married and had a son named Obed, who would soon become the grandfather of one of the greatest leaders Israel had ever known.
So the world is full of in-law jokes. I heard about a guy who was in his front yard when a funeral procession was driving by, and he noticed that immediately behind the hearse was a man and his wife, his family, and one very large dog on a leash. But what was most intriguing to him was the 200 or so men walking in a line behind the family. It turns out that the guy in the front yard knew the guy walking behind the hearse with his family and the large dog. And so the man just walked out of the front yard and very quietly made his way up beside that man. And he just began to express his condolences for the loss that that man and his family had. And he went on to ask, "Who is it that's in the hearse?" And the man said, "Oh, that's my mother-in-law that's just passed away." And the fellow who had come out of the front yard that was watching this whole scene said, "Well, I'm so sorry. How did she pass?" And the guy said, "Well, our dog bit her several days ago, and she passed." The fellow thought for a moment and said, "May I borrow the dog?" And the man said, "Sure, get in line." Like I said, the world is not short on in-law jokes. And I've been thinking about in-laws this whole past week as we've been in the book of Ruth together. If you're with us for the very first time, we are in the midst of a journey through a reading plan in Scripture called The Story, in which takes us through Genesis through Revelation. And the idea is when you're done, you will have read through about 80 to 85% of the Bible, and you'll have a sense of the grand story that the Bible tells from Genesis to Revelation, all revolving around Jesus Christ. And this past week, we've been in chapter 9 of the story, which is, of course, the book of Ruth. It's about a woman named Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, among a few other folks we'll get to here in just a moment. Speaking of Naomi, that's exactly where the book of Ruth begins. Naomi in the Hebrew means sweet. And yet the irony is the story opens with Naomi's life being anything but sweet. It begins with Naomi and her husband named Elimelech and their two sons. They are living in the promised land of Canaan, specifically the town of Bethlehem. And yet they're in the midst of a famine. And so they head to the country of Moab to look for food, or the region of Moab. If you were with us last week, this is happening during the time of the Judges, which is the story that we looked at last week. And it's a terribly difficult time. And times must really be desperate for Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their two boys to travel into Moabite territory. If you remember from last week's reading in Judges, the Moabites and the Israelites were bitter enemies. The Moabites were seen as horrible, wicked people who had raided and ransacked the Israelites on occasion. The Moabites were noted for worshiping a god by the name of Chemosh and engaging in all kinds of despicable worship rituals that involved everything from temple prostitution to self-mutilation to child sacrifices. And there was so much animosity between the Israelites, which is, of course, who Naomi and Elimelech and their two boys are, and the Moabites. And so things had to be desperate for an Israelite like Naomi and Elimelech to go into the region of Moab and to take their sons there to try and survive. But at least Naomi has her husband and her boys when they enter into Moab. But then tragically, Naomi's husband dies in Moab. And a grieving Naomi is left as a widow with her two boys who grow up there. And then while they're there, they fall in love with two Moabite women and eventually marry these two Moabite women. One of them, her name is Ruth, and the other is named Orpah, not Oprah, not Orca, but Orpah. But this had to be difficult for Naomi, for her two boys to marry two Moabite women. A decade passes, and then the unthinkable happens again. Both of Naomi's sons die. Now she's lost her husband, she's lost her sons in Moab. Everything that she loves and cares about so deeply is gone, and she's stuck with two Moabite daughters-in-law. On top of the incredible relational loss she's feeling, she's now at the bottom of society. She's a widow in a foreign land, probably too old to marry. Her parents are dead. Her husbands are dead. Her sons are dead. Her family line is going to die out with her, and there's no one to really care for her. She's lost pretty much everything, and she feels like she's even lost God. So she decides to return home to Bethlehem to try and start her life over again. And I don't know if you picked up on this when you were reading in the book of Ruth this past week, but did you notice what happens when she arrives in Bethlehem? You read this in Ruth 1:19 through 21, that when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." And Naomi at this point believes that God has turned completely against her. She says, "He has made me empty. He has brought misfortune upon me." Later in the story, she'll talk about God's hand being against her. But she's not as empty as she thinks she is, because she's returned to Bethlehem with Ruth. She tried to shed Ruth earlier, the way she shed Orpah. She told both of her Moabite daughters-in-law when she was in Moab, "Y'all stay here. Y'all go on and find yourself some Moabite men to marry. I'm going to go back." And Orpah takes her up on it. She stays in Moab. But Ruth stays with Naomi. And while Naomi has endured incredible loss, Ruth is choosing incredible loss when she chooses to return to Bethlehem with Naomi. And Ruth echoes those powerful words to Naomi, words that we're used to hearing at weddings. She says these famous words. These are where the words originate. The words of Ruth to Naomi. She says to Naomi, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And it's so ironic to me that this line is so quoted at funerals between brides and grooms and brides, when originally it was said from a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. And I know some of you are thinking, there ain't no way I'm saying that to my in-laws. But the gravity of this statement is even heavier than any of us can appreciate. Think about this. Ruth is committing to immigrate, to become a part of Israel's people and culture. Now think about why people migrate from one country to another. They migrate because they're looking for a better life. They have a hope for a better life. I'm sure Ruth thinks the opposite. She's not going to have a better life. She's not just moving into Israel as a young widow with no children and a bitter mother-in-law. She's moving as part of a hated race. Throughout the entire book of Ruth, she's going to be known as Ruth the Moabite. The writer's not going to let you forget about it. And for all she knows, the rest of her adult life, she's going to be living in the midst of a community that's probably going to hate her. And her life is going to be characterized by poverty, by rejection, by even violence. In fact, there's this disturbing story in Ruth chapter 2 where a kind man named Boaz, who we'll talk about in just a second, tells Ruth that she can pick up some grain in his field, but he has to warn his servants not to assault Ruth. Think about that. He has to tell his servants, don't assault her. That was the kind of risk she was walking into. And yet she says to Naomi, where you go, I go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Now just think about how Ruth then might have felt when she's going into Bethlehem and Naomi says, I'm putting in for a name change. Call me Mara. I'm bitter. God has left me completely empty. And Ruth is standing right beside her, being so ruggedly committed to her. That's no daughter-in-law. That's a daughter in love. So one day, they're in Bethlehem, and Ruth sets out to find some food for herself and Naomi. One of the laws that God had given the Israelites was that every time a farmer would reap a harvest, they were to allow the poor to follow behind the harvesting and pick up the scraps of grain that they missed. Ruth offers to go out and do this. She offers to go out and work in one of the fields to get something to eat for her and Naomi. This was risky as a Moabite, but Naomi lets her. And then the writer puts it this way, and this is beautiful. Ruth 2 and verse 3. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Ruth just happens to have stumbled into a field belonging to Boaz, who was just happened to be related to Naomi's deceased husband Elimelech, who just happened to be related to Ruth's deceased father-in-law. I'll talk more about this in a second. But when Boaz discovers that she is an outsider, a Moabite widow who came with Naomi back to Bethlehem, he showers her with kindness. He shows her mercy. And I don't have much doubt that, Boaz might have also been attracted to her, yes, but this is something to think about. Boaz showing mercy to an outsider from Moab. And here's why it's worth noting. Because do you know who Boaz's mother was? Boaz's mother was Rahab. Does that ring a bell? Rahab is the Canaanite prostitute from Joshua chapter 2 who houses Israel's spies and says that she believes that Israel's God has given her land, the land of Canaan, to his people. This Canaanite sides with the Israelites, gives shelter to the Israelite spies in her own home. And eventually, when Israel finally invades Canaan, she and her family are spared, and she's integrated into Israel's family. Rahab winds up marrying an Israelite and has a baby boy named Boaz. And perhaps Boaz knows his mama's own story of being an outsider, a Canaanite, who risked her life in choosing to go with the Israelites and was taken in by the Israelites. And now here he is showing mercy to an outsider. Fascinating. And now he's showering an outsider with kindness. Oh, I love how Naomi responds when Ruth comes back and says, "You'll never guess what happened in the field today," and tells her about a man named Boaz. Naomi says in Ruth 2 and verse 20, "That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." Now, what in the world is that? Well, that's another one of the laws that God had given his people. It was for the sake of helping women who were widowed and children who were orphaned. In the event the head of the family were to pass, the widow and the children were to be taken in by one of the brothers or relatives of the deceased husband as their own. And the relative would actually then buy all of the family's land or property in order to give the widow some financial security and to keep the land in the family name. That was the idea. This relative is called the guardian redeemer. But Boaz wasn't the closest relative to Naomi's husband. That's why as the story unfolds, he has to have a meeting with the entire clan of Elimelech that he is a part of, and he has to give a closer relative the right of first refusal. The closer relative is very interested in Naomi's land, but he doesn't want anything to do with being responsible for Naomi and Ruth. He doesn't want to divide his estate any more than he already has to among family. Boaz steps up and says, "I'm willing to redeem the land. I'm willing to redeem Naomi. I'm willing to redeem Ruth. I will risk my estate to do it." And they agree. And so Boaz takes in Naomi as his mother-in-law because he takes Ruth as his wife. And later they have a baby boy named Obed who winds up inheriting this land that belongs to Elimelech. And Naomi winds up with a bouncing baby boy of a grandson, Obed, who in many ways she raises as her own son. And the people of the town say as much. Naomi has a son, even though he's her grandson. The people say to Naomi, "Ruth is better for you than 7 sons. Why do they say that? Because they know that Ruth made the difference for Naomi. Had it not been for Ruth, the Moabite, journeying back with Naomi to Bethlehem, being willing to work in a field to take care of Naomi and herself, Boaz might not have discovered them at all." And it's as though they were saying, "Ruth is better to you than 7 sons, that the grace of God upon you is richer than you even realized." And Naomi goes from this state of being bitter to being better. Speaking of Ruth, though, her son Obed would wind up growing up and becoming the father of Jesse, and Jesse is going to become the father of a man named David, who's going to turn out to be the greatest king in all the Old Testament. You know him as King David. But we're not done yet, because as the story unfolds, not only is Ruth King David's great-grandmother, but Jesus himself is in her downline. Jesus is a direct descendant of hers. Now think about this. Ruth's husband Boaz is the son of a Canaanite woman, Rahab. So you have a Canaanite woman that's upstream for Jesus, and you also have a Moabite woman named Ruth that's upstream from Jesus. And so later when you're reading in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 1, the very first chapter of the very first gospel of the New Testament, you're reading about the genealogy of Jesus, and there are 5 women mentioned in the genealogy. 2 of those women that are mentioned by name are Ruth the Moabite and Rahab the Canaanite. You say, Chris, what's your point? My point is this. Long before Jesus came along, God was bringing in other nations into what he was doing in Jesus Christ. It wasn't just the Jewish people. He was bringing in the Canaanites. He was bringing in the Moabites. He was bringing in the whole world and including them in his plan, eventually bringing Jesus out of them. God's heart, even in the Old Testament, is for the whole world to be connected to the Messiah, Jesus, that he might be moving through the Jewish people, his people, but he had a world missions heart the whole time, seeing to it that a Canaanite and a Moabite themselves are woven into the family, and Jesus is a direct descendant of them. Well, we're moving into some application. So let me leave you with 3 from the story of Ruth this past week. The first is this. The story of Ruth reminds us that God can often be misunderstood by us while he works out his purposes for us and through us. God can often be misunderstood by us while he works out his purposes for us and through us. The story begins with Naomi returning to Bethlehem, and she puts in for this name change. Call me Mara, for bitter. She's bitter because she feels like God has left her empty-handed and his hand has turned against her. And yet right underneath her nose is Ruth, who God will work through to bless her in an extraordinary way. The whole time Naomi says, I got nothing. Ruth is God's something for her. She had no idea. Her future and her hope was tied up in a daughter-in-law she was trying to shake and just trying to say, stay in Moab and find a Moabite dude to marry. She had no idea her future and hope was tied up in Ruth. Isn't the graciousness and patience of God extraordinary? The whole time she's claiming that God has turned against her, he's in the midst of providing for her. And it could be that there are some of us even here today that are in a stretch of time in our life where we feel like we are empty-handed. We feel like the Lord has left us empty-handed, that his hand has turned against us. And yet there could be a blessing right underneath our nose, but we can't see it right now. And you might feel like you're empty-handed. You may want to put in for a name change yourself. Call me Mara. Just name me for bitterness. And maybe the prayer to pray right now is that God would open your eyes to help you see a blessing right underneath your nose. Oh, God is doing so much here, but not just for Naomi. He's doing something beyond her. I told you that story about Ruth being from Moab, a Moabite. You know where the whole Moabites come from? They come from a terrible story way back in Genesis involving a man named Lot. Lot was the nephew of Abraham, some of you remember. Lot gets drunk and has an incestuous relationship with his daughters, and the product of that relationship are what you know as the Moabite people. Lot and Abraham had a falling out over land, and the falling out continued for some time. Then Lot does that terrible thing, has a nation of descendants called the Moabites from him. There's enmity between the Moabites and the Israelites for centuries. And now, all of a sudden, God is bringing an Israelite and a Moabite together to birth his son from later. Do you see what's happening? God is bringing enemies together. He's getting the whole family of even Abraham and Lot back together. This is a preview of what he wants to do in Jesus, that he wants to bring everyone divided back together, and he's doing it through the story of Naomi and Ruth. And right now, you might be in a place where you feel empty-handed. Right now, you may be in a place where you feel like I'm in a bitter, bitter place. And just say, God, I pray you would open my eyes to help me see a blessing of yours right underneath my nose. Because it's easy to sometimes misunderstand God while he's working out his purposes for you. and through you, and he's doing stuff even beyond you. There's a second takeaway, I think, and it's this: God's hand is not just found in the miraculous, but also in the mundane. If you put the book of Ruth up to everything we've been reading so far in the story, there's something different about it, because there's nothing explicitly miraculous in the story of Ruth. There aren't any burning bushes. There aren't any parting seas or rivers. There aren't any plagues or dreams or voices from heaven. There's no explicit, overt intervention from God. Some of you probably thought, this is boring this week. I mean, it's just a group of people trying to live and survive. It's a daughter-in-law embracing great risk and sacrifice to stick it out with her mother-in-law. It's a man named Boaz fulfilling an obligation to care for the poor, to care for a widow. It's a man named Boaz falling in love with a woman named Ruth. And yet the hand of God is all in it. God's hand is not just found in the explicitly miraculous. God's hand is also found in the mundane. And you might be in a stretch right now of just, you're making sacrifices. You're fulfilling obligations. You're showing kindness. You're working the plan day in, day out, and there's nothing much miraculous going on. But don't assume that God's not in it. Because one of the things the story of Ruth reminds us is that God can be found in the mundane and not just the overtly miraculous. He does some of his best work in the midst of people fulfilling obligations, showing mercy, showering others with kindness. He does some of his best work through people who are willing to be ruggedly committed to another person. Don't assume God's not in the mundane and that God's not blessing it. And that leads me really to a third takeaway from the story of Ruth, and it's this: that some of God's best healing work happens through people loving others when it's hard. Some of his best healing work happens through people loving others when it's hard. Ruth says those words: where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I stay. Where you're buried, I'm buried. Your God will be my God. Words brides and grooms say to each other was first uttered by a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. And those are words of rugged commitment over the long haul. And it was hard, costly love for a while. There wasn't much at first for Ruth to gain as a Moabite in Bethlehem. She couldn't even count on her mother-in-law to have a good attitude about it. And in Ruth, you have this example of what it looks like to love when it's hard, when the times are hard, when the people are hard, when it's even hard to see God. And yet God uses people in mighty ways who are willing to love when it's hard. In fact, when you think about it, isn't that when you really know someone loves you? Not when it's easy, but when it's hard. And the reality is, if you're going to talk about people loving when it's hard, it's not going to take you long before you get to the person of Jesus. This is just a preview of Jesus, because he's the ultimate example of God healing the world through someone willing to love when it's hard. In fact, Jesus will remind you that loving hard oftentimes means loving scarred. And this is Ruth laying it on the line for Naomi, and Naomi the whole time is saying, I'm empty-handed, and Ruth is like, what do you think I'm here doing, you know? This is also a picture of parenthood, by the way, of rugged commitment to love while somebody else can't always see it. And oh, don't we do that to God, who's ruggedly committed to loving us? And there are times when we are standing there going, he's left us empty-handed. And Jesus reminds us that loving hard means loving scarred. And when you think of Jesus in light of this story comes to a whole new meaning. That just as Ruth's guardian redeemer came out of Bethlehem, so is ours. Just as Ruth was an outsider, at some point we all are because of our sin. Just as Boaz was willing to risk his whole estate to redeem Ruth and the family, so Jesus has risked his whole estate. and paid the ultimate sacrifice upon the cross to be our guardian redeemer. Our Redeemer too has come out of Bethlehem. Oh, there's a powerful moment where Boaz says to Ruth, when he realizes who she is that's in his field, he says, may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And Ruth will later say to him, I am your servant, Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are the guardian redeemer of our family. It's interesting, that word garment is the same Hebrew word for wing. When Ruth first meets Boaz, he refers her and says, may you find refuge under the Lord's wings. And later, she comes to him and says, let me tell you what, you are the expression of the Lord's wings. May I come under you permanently. Ruth is asking Boaz to be God's wings for her. And in a sense, this is what we do when we come to Jesus and find our refuge at the cross, the place that's the ultimate expression of the wings of God, giving everything he has to redeem us, spreading himself out upon a cross. The language of finding refuge and redemption under the cover of the Lord is all over Scripture. In Psalm 17, verses 6 through 8, the psalmist says, I call on you, my God, for you will answer me. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. In Psalm 36 and 7, you find the psalmist saying, how priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. And it's at the cross of Jesus you find the ultimate expression of finding shadow in the extension of God's wings spread wide. Paul would say in Ephesians 1 and verse 7, in him we have redemption. There's that word, redemption. To be redeemed. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. I don't know where you see yourself in the story of Ruth this week. It could be that some of you are in that stretch like Naomi right now. You just feel empty-handed. Ask for the grace of God to be upon you to see a blessing of his that's right underneath your nose. Others of us may be in a position of Ruth where we are in a stretch of rugged commitment, of loving someone who's hard or loving someone in the midst of difficult circumstances, or perhaps loving someone even in the midst of it being hard to see God right now. Or maybe others of us may be thinking, you know what? It's time for me to find my refuge in Jesus, because I've looked for refuge everywhere but him. I don't know where you are, but I pray that you would heed the voice of the Spirit of God and what he might be saying to your heart right now.